Hi, and welcome to this episode of Brainy Moms, brought to you by Learning RX Brain Training Centers. I'm your host, Dr. Amy Moore, here with my co-host, Teri Miller, coming to you today, as usual, from Colorado Springs, Colorado. We are excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Michael Alcee. Michael is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Tarrytown, New York, and he's a mental health educator at Manhattan School of Music. He specializes in psychology of artists and everyday creativity, as well as the professional development of therapists. His contributions have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, NPR, Salon.com, Sirius Radio, and even on the TEDx stage.
We are so glad you're here, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm excited to have a conversation together, guys.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I have to confess that we have already laughed and had such great conversation even before we've started the recording. So this is going to be fun, entertaining, super informational. So stick with us till the end. I just know it's going to be great. So yeah, before we even get into all the good information you've got for us, I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your story and how you became passionate about the integration of psychology and creativity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always been interested in the link between literature and therapy. When I was in college, I took a literature and psychoanalysis course, which blew my mind because we read like Freud and Lacan along all the great story writers. And then, of course, my mom was a social worker who was also a student of literature. So whenever we talked about therapy, we were talking about deepening our understanding of characters. But I really fell in love with the combination when I started reading Oliver Sacks. And, his neuroscientific work on bringing together the stories of all of his interesting and unique patients. And I thought, gosh, I got to study biology too. So as I studied biology and psychology, I've always kept a connection between, I'm an amateur pianist and I've always appreciated literature. And then I always worked in college counseling, but then I ended up doing a side gig at Manhattan School of Music. And what better place working with classical and jazz musicians and musical theater folks to see the inherent links between what's going on psychologically and what's happening artistically.
So interesting. It's just such an interesting niche. And I'm a musical theater person, so I love this niche. And I've really enjoyed reading some of what you've got out there and listening to your podcast. So this is cool stuff.
Yeah, I grew up on the stage too. So this is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were both triple threats. I wasn't going to tell the audience, but.
That was my degree in college.
I knew it, Amy.
All right.
So you have told us that you're excited to share how to maintain children's natural creativity. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Picasso had this wonderful idea that all children are artists, but they forget once they grow up, right? And we also saw that in my favorite scene in The Little Prince, that wonderful story for adults and children. The Little Prince is making a picture and he says, are you guys scared of this? And they say, why should we be scared of a hat? And he's like, what are you talking about? This is a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant. And so I think there's something about the magical kind of openness and divergent thinking, the novelty, the variety that children, that's what their currency is. And I think there's something about making sure that we keep tending to it and cultivating it and enjoying it. I think that's the reason as parents, we get so much fulfillment because we re-enchant it with the magic of creativity that's actually available to all of us. And so I'm really passionate about saying, wait, why do we have to give that up? We can learn how to refine it and use our reason and our logic and our language and all these other wonderful discriminating capacities. But one of the things that I see in psychotherapy is that we lose touch with how to just know this other natural language. And it's a dialect of the other languages that we know.
Creativity is.
Yeah.
Creativity is a complete dialect, and recognizing how creativity and what you might call maybe logic, because sometimes logic isn't as creative, right? It's very, very sequential and linear. But, the best artists and the best scientists, just as the most integrated people, learn how to toggle back and forth between creativity and more linear thinking.
Yes.
And actually, when you bring them together, that's why I use the metaphor of a jazz musician when understanding how therapy works, right? Because a jazz musician is extraordinarily disciplined and aware of music theory and how chords change and harmonies change. But they're also working with that right in the moment, spontaneously, using that freewheeling creative side of themselves to have an emotional connection. And so there's no kind of separation. There's a complete integration and interconnection between those. And imagine if we could help our kids learn how to appreciate how these chord changes happen, and we could do it with them. So I kind of see it as parenting as being a really good jazz partner, really good musician in the band alongside, and to say, boy, that kid has chops, you know? Instead of saying, oh man, look at this misbehavior, or, oh my gosh, I can't believe this thing happened. I was expecting them to go there. Like, no, that's the beauty. But how do we make and find a new form out of that together? And especially since we have more expertise and more development cognitively, how do we help steward that in service of something larger?
Oh, I love that. And so I love how you talk about nurturing that integration. I talk about science writers, right? Who they have to have the creativity to make their writing engaging and draw readers in, but they have to understand the science of what they're actually writing in terms of the content. Or I talk about scientists who play musical instruments, like you and I both play the piano, but we're both scientists, right? And so to be able to say, like, I own and integrate all sides of who we are. And nurture those together and use the strengths from each, right? So,
what's also funny about it? Oh, sorry, Teri. What's so interesting about it too that you mentioned? I want to kind of put a plug at. We talk a lot about outer diversity, which is wonderful as a field, and inclusivity. I think sometimes we forget about this inner diversity that we have. That we have multiple characters and multiple selves inside. So, Walt Whitman said, I am large, I contain multitudes. We all contain multitudes, and we're often shifting back. That's why, like, in one moment in the morning, I'm feeling one way, and then later, an hour or two later, I'm feeling a different way. And I'm like, what happened? Where did I go? And yet that isn't a problem. That's the beauty of how we're built, to be able to be so flexible and plastic and move into different territories. But what happens when we are moving somewhere else, and then our partner or our friend or our family is moving somewhere else? And so, the funny thing is, we all start with a polyphonic heart and mind, like a fugue. There are these voices, and they kind of intermingle, and they can create seeming dissonances, but they're also part of the beauty if you look at the inner structure. And our job is to learn how to really get to master that polyphony, and then also become virtuosic in which voice we're expressing right now.
Okay, so you're talking in a lot of analogy and beautiful creative language. I want to get specific. I want you to give me some specific ideas. Yeah. Okay, so I want to get practical, because I'm a mom of kids that are growing through these stages. Okay, so I'm going to just use, for an example, the youngest 4 that I have at home. So just the youngest 4.
Teri has 9 kids, by the way.
Yeah, I've read about that. That's the word on the street. Yeah.
It's crazy. Talk about creativity. Woo! A little crazy too.
Yeah.
Okay. So the youngest 4 at home. So my 16-year-old son, he was such an artist, like literally drawing. He would create new creatures. He would write, they would do tape. He and a couple of my other kids, they would take pieces of paper together and create these long stories, almost like timeline of a story, like movie, with different creatures. And they'd write things about it, and he would invent things, and just so creative, just really, really amazing. Right. So somewhere along the way, like you said, he's kind of lost that. And he has become, and I don't know how I missed cultivating it, right? So he's become very, very cerebral. He's super, super smart. He's already in college classes. He's very practical. He's just left those things behind. Now, he does still play D&D with his older in college siblings and a couple of their friends. So that's cool. They get online and do that. So he has a little piece of it, but for the most part, it's like he's put that behind him. Okay, next one down. She's a dancer. She has been a dancer. She has stuck with it. She loves it, but she doesn't integrate that somehow. It's compartmentalized. So she's at the dance studio 5 days a week. She dances, and then she's like, school, have to get through it. Next one down. Again, so much like my 16-year-old, super creative artist. He is right in that transition. He's 12. He is leaving it behind. He's already started going to this early college's school, already doing college prep stuff, because again, he's super book smart and cerebral, and he wants to know stuff and dig in, but he almost has this disdain for that creativity. Okay, my youngest, she's 9. She's so precious and creative. She draws all the time. She wants to paint. She creates things. She'll go Google things. She wants to look up to how to draw it. And okay, how can I help her hold on to that? And how can I encourage the ones that are in those various stages of losing it or compartmentalizing it? What can I do? There's my story.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. You want to hear the good news or the bad news? You want to hear both? No, you want to hear both.
Bad news first.
No, the bad news isn't bad at all. That's the funny part. The ironic part is there's no bad news really in this.
Oh, okay, good.
So the good news is that this is actually the natural and normative development of all of us.
Okay.
We need to really start in this place of really being creative and interesting in these different things and having less boundaries and differentiation. And then we become specialists. We need to become specialists to cultivate a certain identity that makes us feel like we feel competent, we feel confident, and also we're growing these other sides that are less creative and more linear. And we want to put those into practice. And so we get disdainful. Even in a way, sometimes if you notice, our own brains kind of work against each other and being a little disdainful of, oh, you're being so immature. Right? We're interesting. We're a square peg in a round hole. We have these wonderful emotions, which are non-linear, and these interesting thoughts, which are linear. And sometimes as we're developing more of the linear side, we can temporarily get disdainful of it. But what's cool is that your older children are developing, getting to learn some more experience and competency with it, and they will return to integrating. But I think this kind of process is a longer stage. And I think adolescence and young adulthood, we're really working on the linear, but still trying to hold on and integrate in little ways, self-respecting ways, if you will. And then I think in more of a mid-adulthood, we actually start to reclaim them.
Okay.
So this to me is like right on course.
Okay.
Right. So Carl Jung said something, I think, we don't really sort of become wise or a full self until the age of 40. Up until then, we're just gathering data.
50 maybe?
50, yeah, 50. Let's say 50. Let's say 50. For Teri in the house, we're gonna say 50.
50 is the new 40, right?
The new 40, yeah, come on. Carl Jung, he was thinking a lot shorter lifespan. So we're talking 50. But the point is that all of this stuff is the data gathering that they're doing that's gonna come back together with this other stuff. And so it's like, think about it as starting in a magical, interconnected place, moving to a place of coming outside of the garden, if you will, right? In that old story of the Garden of Eden, by the way, it seems like a loss, but this is the beginning of actual creativity, right? Because there's more free will, there's the capacity to name things, there's actual birth going on. That's a place, but we also struggle. And then we reclaim it by integrating.
Okay.
That's why you see sometimes artists at later stages, like look at Picasso's work, it's interesting. He did a lot of representational work on landscapes and figures, very traditional if you look at his course of his life. But then he went back to painting like a child and seeing the world through childlike imagery. And that's what revolutionized how his painting worked. So I actually think it's important to see this as like almost like 3 stages. And not to get scared, oh my God, they've lost it forever. They haven't lost it forever. It's still there. And that's going to serve in some interesting way when they bring it together in their own unique voice.
Okay.
Does that help?
Are there things as a parent I should be doing to even like with my 16-year-old? I mean, maybe is it just the simple thing of like, instead of saying, dude, you need to do your homework, go forget that D&D game. But as a parent, should I be doing things like, carve out that time? That is so good for your creative brain, buddy. I love it. Take a day off of your homework. I mean, is that good to help encourage that?
Yeah, I want to share a simple analogy that you can use with kids, which I use with when I worked at Vassar College, and I worked with these very, very brilliant students, and I was like 27, and I was like, what am I going to give these kids? And I was like, how do I get them to kind of think more openly about the different sides of themselves? So I created this metaphor. And it's like therapy is like we have this table before us, or living is like we have this table before us. And our job is to bring all those sides to the table and have a conversation. And we're curious about which side talks the most, which side talks the least, and which sides or sides aren't invited or allowed at the table. And we constantly want to get more curious about all those sides and remember them, because those sides that you forget, those sides that you neglect, those sides that you exile, they will try and rebel or try and throw anxiety or depression or other things at you to say, hey, remember me? I'm still part of you. So you're right, it is helpful and healthy to encourage our children to get to know these many sides of self, which they instinctively do. We actually, as parents and teachers, are the ones who actually condition them out of it in a way, ironically, because we say, I don't like that side, right? Or that side is not appropriate, which is healthy because we want to give them civility and morals and all that kind of stuff. But then what we want to also do is help them to just be non-judgmentally aware of what those sides are and what they might also offer. And the surprising things. So interesting, you ever see that movie Inside Out, that Pixar movie, which is about all these different sides of the table?
It's so good.
The guy who was working on that film, in the beginning, Joy is the main character. Mm-hmm. And he really gave sadness a very little role in the earlier drafts. And the people who he was working with said, this film is going nowhere. You don't bring sadness into the picture in any way. And so the whole film is about how this character wants to push away sadness because it feels like it's yucky and disgusting and not helpful. But actually helping our kids learn how to lean into the negative emotions or the difficult emotions. You know, some of the stuff that we're seeing with Daniel Pink has written a book about the power of regret. Susan Cain just wrote a book about bittersweetness, right? Susan David talks about emotional agility. All these different influencers, some of whom are not even psychologists, are writing about the importance of leaning in. And so I think this is another way of leaning in and just regularly checking in with, hey, remember that side?
Yeah, I love that. I love all the different pieces coming in. So good. Yes. Thank you.
Because to the extent we suppress or repress, what happens is those things kind of go underground and they try and speak to us in other ways. And then we're confused. Why am I tired? Why am I drained? Why am I depressed? Why am I feeling conflicted?
Yeah.
And because of that polyphony, we never lose them. They're there. It's almost like an orchestra. They're still in the orchestra, but you're like, wait a minute, you got to give the winds a turn.
Okay. So as a parent, as an adult, you talk about, you've talked about, I think it was in a podcast episode called You're in the Club Too. You talk about little C creativity and capital C creativity. Tell us about that.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. So it's so funny. I've worked with artists, right? Musicians, and funny enough, they sometimes don't think they're creative too, because they don't see personal creativity as relevant to what they're doing, right? In other words, this whole kind of what we're doing right now is personal creativity. Okay. Riffing and going back and forth and opening new dimensions of our experience is personal creativity. And then people, if you're not a painter, if you're not a dancer, if you're not an actor, most people think I have no creative bone in my body. And that's false too. You can get the person who is completely non-conventionally artistic, and they're as artistic as they come, because this artistry thing is something that's built into us neurologically. We would not have survived and evolved without this kind of ingenuity and resourcefulness. And our feelings are extraordinarily creative, by the way. Our thoughts are, I sometimes think of us as, and Amy, you tell me if this sounds right, we're sophisticated emotion regulation machines and constant idea generators, right? Idea generators about the present, the past, and the future. Sometimes that idea generating gets in the way because we worry too much about the future or we regret too much about the past. But our system is built in such a way to be constantly working on this stuff. Just it is to say, how do I feel about this? What's my level of equilibrium? And so that's a very, very creative and sophisticated process. And I think we don't think about that when we think of mental health. Many of us think about psychological disorders or problems, anxiety or depression or these kinds of things, but we don't think about, wait, what's the resourcefulness that we all have access to?
Okay.
So that's the little c creativity, which I only say it little c just to differentiate it.
Okay.
because you could still be creating a symphony in your life, even if you're not writing one.
I love that.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask also about having to be good at something in order to consider yourself creative. So one of my older daughters, college age daughters, Eliza, she sent to the family, she did a post to our big family text, and it was about dabbling in things, enjoying things, and not having to be good at it. And it was a quote from someone. Yeah. And it was, someone saying, oh, well, I'm a painter and a writer and a musician and a guitar, whatever. And then the person they were talking to said, oh, wow. So are you good at those things? Do you have some work or whatever? And the person responded, no, not at all. I'm not good at it, but I love it.
Yeah.
And that conversation opened up, like, can we not be so performance oriented so that we can let ourselves be creative without having to be good at things? Talk more about that and how we can do better.
It's beautiful. And I think that's such a common tick in American culture, right? To kind of have this knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, then you must be this. Oh, you must be great. It becomes about achievement. Mm-hmm. And those are the seeds of objectifying. And, that's where little kids they're so much more evolved than us because they don't objectify so much yet.
Oh, yeah.
They stay in their subjective experience and they recognize the moments of eternity and transcendence in not knowing, in, like this kind of Zen Buddhist idea of not knowing. And they don't see uncertainty, they see possibility. But the problem is that we often then look at these things as a way of kind of defining things. And also like we have this kind of obsession with achievement, as if achievement is the highest standard or the highest thing we should all be seeking. Right. And it's actually it's sort of a silly kind of myth, because we know, like the social psychology, there's old social psychology research. If you reward kids for doing something they already like, they stop doing it and they actually enjoy it less. So like the over-justification effect, I think is what it was called. But it's actually better. And that's why, it's so funny. I see this in therapy every day. When people come to me, they say, whoa, wait, what should I talk about? What do you want me to, or what should I, so that this is most productive? I'm like, oh, don't worry about it. Who cares? Don't worry. You're going to talk about what's most important to you. And I'm going to track that. And then once we start doing, we can look at that more as an object, but we have to respect your subject to it first. It's sort of like what I think was so beautiful about what Mr. Rogers did. That's why I referenced him in the book in the beginning, because I think what Mr. Rogers did is he said, listen, this subjective world, this place of being valued in of yourself intrinsically is the core of everything. Your external achievements come from that place. And yet, as a culture, sometimes as parents, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as friends, we all can go for the shortcut and say, no, now this is great for you. And of course, that forms the seeds of perfectionism too, because the perfectionism says, I must be this object for myself and for others in order to exist. And it means that we have to become static creatures. And what I love about what I think it was your daughter you said who did this, right? Mm-hmm. Is that it's actually in being able to be fluid where we find ourselves. Actually, in being lost is how we are found. So psychological growth happens in the paradox. And when we remove that paradox, we become an object. Winnicott, the great pediatrician and developmental kind of psychoanalyst, talked about the constant importance of having potential space, which was the interface, the interconnection between imagination and reality. And there should be no choosing between them. There should be both and. And when we objectify, we take away imagination and replace it with reality. And we exploit imagination in the service of reality. Mm-hmm. And why should we cut ourselves in half?
Yeah, I love that this is about, instead of an outcome orientation, it's an experience orientation, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. That you're missing the joy in the journey. And as adults, we're very much outcomes driven. We're very much goal oriented. And so if what we're doing isn't moving us towards a goal, then we feel like we're wasting time, right? That we're spending time on something that isn't as important. Whereas if you look at it from the mindset of a child who experiences such joy in what they're doing, in the process, and then where does that switch happen?
Yeah. It's really interesting. It happens gradually. And you know what's interesting about it too, Amy, that you mentioned that I think is really important? Because you mentioned efficiency. Ironically, we think we're losing efficiency, but have you ever watched children? Recognize how efficient they are in using the data of their experience and making adjustments and constantly tweaking things and then divergent thinking, figuring out new ways, right? So I think we should flip the script and say, that's why I say sometimes as parents should learn from our children to reconnect and do that work, Teri, that you said, wait, how does my child lose that? That's so sad. No. But we need to be reminded by children again, how we can tap into that now more fully in an integrated way. And you're right. How do we lose that? Is that we start to say, no, that's not what that's used for, right? Or, oh, no, you don't do it that way. Or, no, that's not helpful. That's not important. Yeah. And so we start to limit and prune. And some of it's helpful. We want to do that, but we also want to say, oh, that's so interesting that you found that way of using it like that. Or isn't that cool? Like my little boy, he's 4 years old, and he'll make a connection between something he's watched on TV and something happening in real life, you know? Or somehow he'll use something different. Like he was like the straw, he wanted to put his drink on the floor and he's like, how do I drink this? And he just said, ooh, and he started to get Scotch tape to tape straws together. And initially my wife was like, no, don't do that. That's not right. And I was like, this is brilliant. No, don't discourage this. This is fantastic. This is ingenuity. This is an engineer's mind working. So I think also we have to recognize that it might take us out of our comfort zone because it means we don't exactly know what's happening. But it's sort of having, interestingly, we talk about efficiency, but it's also trusting in a certain faith. And ironically, you know, Amy, you know, we're talking about efficiency. People come into therapy with me and say, if I don't have an agenda, aren't we going to waste our time? Actually, it turns out we will do more quicker, more in depth, more interesting. And the other thing, Amy and Teri, as you notice, as we've talked, right? We planned stuff before we came on here, but haven't we surprised each other with the places that we've went? And hasn't that made the experience that much more interesting? See, creativity revels in surprise and delights in kind of not entropy, but delights in this fluidity. And that actually can be very efficient. And that's why I use jazz as a metaphor, because jazz musicians are moving all around, but they're tight knowing the form. And I think helping children to learn, wait, they read the changes, they shift in the changes fast. We know how to notice what changes are happening. And together we can help them master that art. And it also can help us look back and say, how does that relate to how I sometimes have a difficulty going from joy to fear or joy to sadness? We are no different. And so it helps us to keep on being, you know, the student always the teacher always the student.
Yeah, I love that. So my middle son is a mechanical engineering major in college. He's in his third year. And this is a child who always had a screwdriver in his hand, whether it was pretend or real, in early childhood. He was always taking his toys apart, putting them back together. You know, he was at the pediatrician's office and the wait was so long that he was trying to undo the pipe underneath the sink in the exam room. And the doctor comes in and says, he's going to be an engineer, which is right. Amazing. And so, but we watched him try out a lot of things and quit. Right. Mm-hmm. And so at the time, I wasn't making the connection that he was just digging into his curiosity about what was available to him. So he would try soccer, he would try martial arts, he would try lacrosse, but he wouldn't last the season. Right. He would decide, no, this isn't for me. And we were so worried and so frustrated that he's afraid to fail. That's what we kept thinking. He's afraid to fail. No, he just wanted to see. He just wanted to try.
I love that.
And we've watched it kind of come full circle. You know, he lives at college, but he rented a garage just so he could tinker, right? He buys a 3D printer and he builds these parts for his motorcycle. And I mean, he's back to where he was, but he's taken all of this experience of how I use my body, how I use my hands, how I use my mind, what feels good, what brings me joy and what doesn't, you know, where he's chosen his path now, like at 21, and all those experiences and choices that he made. And we went with it, right? We just went with it. You don't want to do that? Okay. But it all makes sense now.
Can I tell you about how cool and smart that was, even though you didn't know it? I mean, you thought, well, we're going to go with it. And I don't know. But so David Epstein wrote a really wonderful book called Range. And he contrasts Tiger Woods and Roger Federer. And in America, we have this mentality that in order to be successful, you should be more like Tiger Woods. You should come out of the womb, you know, very ready to, you know, grab a driver, or, you know, learn how to putt and keep on working and get in those thousands of hours. What is it, like the 10,000 hour rule or something like that, to become proficient at something? And that you shouldn't kind of veer from that too much. Otherwise, you're not going to really be a super success. But then he looked at Roger Federer and said, wait, Roger Federer did it differently. In fact, his mother was, I think, a tennis coach, but he started with like soccer and did other sports and didn't really commit fully until tennis until later on. But you see, like, he's super proficient, right? Probably one of the best in the world, and has used stuff from some of his other sports, some of his squash skills he's used in tennis and some of his great recovers. But he cultivated a sense of range. And Epstein talks about the ways in which not only athletes like that, but scientists and artists really are smart to take time to dabble. And then what they do is they take certain skills and experiences from these different disciplines and they bring them into where they eventually specialize in. Right. And I think that is interesting and better than like the old model where we said you should be well-rounded and sort of have like everything. It's not that you have to be super alpha in everything, but it is helpful to try out a lot because you want to get to figure out what's the match between your passion and your skill set. And that compatibility is where we're in the creative zone. So I quickly learned, like, I was a musician growing up, but I couldn't think as fast on my feet to be a jazz improviser, even though I wished to be, right? Mm-hmm. But it turns out my jazz teacher, Andy Jaffe from Williams College, love him so much. I used to marvel at how he could listen to a song and tell you exactly what the chord changes were and solo on it like that. And what I realized, I didn't know that he was teaching me how to be a good therapist, because that I can improvise much better in, because that's how I'm built. Yeah. And so it's really understanding what is your nature. Like you said, Amy, like you could see your son had that nature from the beginning. It's just like, there's a wonderful story of an English choreographer. And she was couldn't focus in class and she was moving around a lot. And her teacher thought there was something wrong with her. So she took her to the doctor, right? And the doctor put on the radio and was talking to her and asking her lots of questions. And he brought in the mother and said, ma'am, I have to tell you something. Your daughter is a dancer. You got to get her into dancing school. There's nothing wrong with her. She's a dancer. Of course, she became like a major producer and a choreographer like Cats or something like that. Wow. And thank God you have to know what the nature is and then to support that. But you're right, it is also helpful to cultivate a range of things without worries about achievement or failure. In fact, Samuel Beckett, the great writer, said, fail again, fail better. And if we let our children, help our children fail better, they'll feel better.
Yeah. And everything's integrated. I love that idea that nothing is lost, that it wasn't, because I've had that. Some of my kids, different experiences they've gone through. My firstborn son, different like job things. And then he's been, like, well, I just failed at that job. I was just no good at that. He's had a lot of medical struggles. So he's, been through some hard stuff. Yeah. And he's had seasons where he has said, well, that season, that was such a fail. But I've really, tried to help him understand, to work on, nothing is lost. And I love that I'm hearing that from you and from you, Amy, and your story, that all of those experiences are building to where we're going and who we are becoming. And it's not fail, it's learn.
Yeah. It's true. It's so funny. I'm reading Quincy Jones, the great music producer and musician, just came out with a book called 12 Notes. And it's literally each is a different note of the musical scale. And each note is about a life lesson. And one of the things he talks about, I mean, I didn't know much about his background. He had a very challenging early story. His mother had really severe schizophrenia and was institutionalized. And, he struggled with a lot of things, including racial discrimination and all sorts of stuff. But his first chapter talks about recycling pain into purpose. And really beautifully kind of seeing all this as material and finding what is your creative vehicle. And for him, it was music to become the creative vehicle to express, contain, and support, honoring these different sides of himself. And along the way, ironically enough, he meets all these surrogate parent figures, whether it's, Clark Terry or Count Basie or, Frank Sinatra. So it's interesting. It's also being in alignment with yourself is really important. And I think you're right. That is when we can be most integrated and most fully realized. And the cool thing about it, then we don't have to worry about being perfect because we're real. Mm-hmm. And I think the joy of being ourselves and also the joy as parents of seeing our children is to see them be real with a capital R. Sort of like, remember that old story of the Velveteen Rabbit? Mm-hmm. Where the Velveteen Rabbit is hoping that one day he'll become a real bunny. That's really what we're trying to do with our children. We're trying to help them become real.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a really poignant moment with my 17-year-old yesterday, who, and this will be controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. So he is an elite musician in the city's youth symphony, and he's a competitive rock climber. And his goal is to go to the Olympics, the next Olympics in rock climbing. And he has been going to college since he was 14, like he's been dually enrolled. And at 17, he has academically kind of fallen apart and disintegrated and said, this is too much. I can't do all of this. I'm too stressed. He's in therapy. And we finally said, then don't. Just don't do it. You've got enough credits. I'll graduate you out of homeschool. We'll just disenroll you from regular school. I'll be your homeschool mom and just give you a diploma and say you're done. And you can focus on music and climbing. And he says to me last night that he said, I just love the freedom of being able to focus on music and climbing right now. And he's going to take a gap year next year. He's just going to do his thing. And we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to let him explore it. And so, my mom, who's a lifelong educator, child development specialist, is like, what do you mean you're just going to graduate him out? What do you mean he's just done with school? Well, because his mental health is more important to me than whether he stays an extra year in school that he doesn't really need.
Yeah. And there is this school called life.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what I love about it too, Amy, I think it also takes so much inner security as a parent and as a child to trust in that. Yeah. And I think there's something really brilliant about that because, it's so funny, think about, I'm a psychologist and I sometimes think about the root of psychology is really the study of the soul, right? And I think it's also the science of the soul. And that's interesting. What Quincy Jones talks about is there's science and soul, and they need to be integrated. Mm-hmm. And how can we kind of ignore or deny the soul of your son saying that this is not where I'm at? Right. But by doing that, the science and the soul can come back together again in what form they need to take. And I think sometimes there is a point of surrendering and letting go and checking our own ego and recognizing that we don't fully know, and that's okay. And I think that's hard for all of us as parents because I think we want to feel more in control and we want to know that they're safe and secure and all that kind of stuff. But ironically, sometimes they will be safer and more secure in being more fully themselves. And only they know those compass points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things I didn't say in that story was that he walked into my office yesterday and I said, oh, how was therapy? And he said, well, it was unnecessary today. And my next appointment's not for a month.
That's awesome.
So, in other words, I know myself pretty well. I don't really need any checks on the hood here.
Because that was like a soul irritant to him. What was going on was the world's expectation, this educational expectation, this cultural expectation was this soul irritant. And
I like that term.
I do too.
Oh, yeah. But he's not a little child anymore. He is stepping into who he is becoming and who he is. And now his soul isn't as irritated. So yeah.
And I love that, because if you look at a soul irritant, right, that's also the dissonance, right, that you're feeling. And who's to say dissonance is bad, but also who's to say that we want to kind of just not help him find the music that's right for him? And an irritant can create, like, if you look at an irritant, right, that could create a pearl if you let it really open.
Yeah.
So I think that's really beautiful. And it takes a lot of, like I said, inner fortitude and compassion and open-mindedness to do that. And that's a form of our parental creativity. Wait, we thought it was going in this direction, but can we see that the data might not always go in that direction as we think? And what do they say in science? The data are always right, right?
Until they're not.
Until, yeah.
There you go. I guess I'm talking to a scientist over there. Until they're not.
Until we gather more data that contradicts the last.
Until we gather more data, yeah.
Right. That's the thing. Science is always changing. That's the creativity and science together.
You're revising your hypothesis, right?
Yes.
And all of a sudden, what you think was the hypothesis is no longer supported. You'd be a fool to keep on doing studies in that same direction.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
it's interesting. I always tell people that statistics is my second language. And the reason I love it is not because I love math, because I don't. I love the story that statistics tells.
Yeah.
And so that's creative, the way that we can, look at the story that can be told through those numbers. So we need to take a break and let Teri read a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about introversion and creativity and how parents can approach that with their kids.
Are you concerned about your child's reading or spelling performance? Are you worried your child's reading curriculum isn't thorough enough? Well, most learning struggles aren't the results of poor curriculum or instruction. They're typically caused by having cognitive skills that need to be strengthened. Skills like auditory processing, memory, and processing speed. Learning RX one-on-one brain training programs are designed to target and strengthen the skills that we rely on for reading, spelling, writing, and learning. Learning RX can help you identify which skills may be keeping your child from performing their best. In fact, they've worked with more than 100,000 children and adults who wanted to think and perform better. They'd like to help get your child on the path to a brighter and more confident future. Give Learning RX a call at 866-BRAIN-01 or visit learningrx.com. That's learningrx.com.
And we're back talking to Dr. Michael Alcee, clinical psychologist who specializes in the integration of psychology and creativity. And so you are actually in California right now, giving a talk on introversion. So I'd love to hear a little bit about introversion and creativity and where parenthood fits in.
Totally. And disclaimer, I'm an introvert extrovert. So there's extroverts, there's introverts, and there's ambiverts, introverted extroverts, right? So I like to think of extroverts as the gas-powered cars of society, and introverts as the electric, and those of us who are in the between hybrids. So interestingly, the reason why introversion actually fits into our discussion of creativity is because all of us start from an introverted place. We start with our imaginary world more prominent than our social extroverted world. So we all start there. But the difference when we talk about introverts, which is, I think, important for parents to know and teachers to know, it's really about how you get energy and how energy drains in you, right? And what's your sweet spot of stimulation? Because an extrovert will love going to a party and talking for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and that will just keep on charging the battery up and the fuel will be just going. But an introvert, after maybe an hour, maybe a half an hour, maybe even an hour and a half,
Done.
It's just going to be overloaded. Done. No more small talk for me. Thank you very much.
That battery is dead.
That's dead. And now I am useless to you, to me. So why am I standing here? And so when you wonder why the introverts find a really hopefully gracious or silly excuse to get out of there, it's not only for their benefit, it's for your benefit too. Because introverts are very tuned into how they work, and they realize that there's only a certain amount of stimulation that they can take, and then they need to go refuel. And unfortunately, in American culture, we have more gas stations than we have electric charging stations. And so in the past, introverts would have to figure out how to like just fake it till you make it, right? Until they got home to be able to be close the door, be by themselves, read a book, do something that re-engages their introverted spirit. Happily, we're much more respectful and interested. There's been a lot of attention for introverts, since Susan Cain wrote her book Quiet and her TED Talk, and there's been many books about introverts and whole online communities, and even many memes, funny memes about introverts. There was one, I think, Introverts Unite in small groups for a limited period of times, right? Right. And I once used that to start a group for introverts on the college campus where I worked. And actually my colleagues made fun of me saying, who's going to show up? And if they do, are they even going to talk? But it was like, if you build it, they will come. They came. And it was the most popular, most diverse, and most interesting group I'd ever run. And so I think what's really important is to recognize, where does your child fit along the spectrum of temperament? Because if you want to know if your child is happy or energized, you got to look at the main issue. How do they get energy? How do they lose energy?
Yeah. I have a teenage counseling client who's an extreme introvert, and she's had to train her family to understand that this is too much. I've had enough, and I need to go and be alone for 2 or 3 hours and recharge. And it's a constant struggle, right? Because people take it personally. So extended family are visiting and they don't understand why she needs to disappear in the middle of a family gathering. Yeah. And so I think as parents, we need to be sensitive to that, recognize the impact that it has on our kids when they are introverts and their battery is dead and drained. And if we continue pushing them to interact when they're with a dead battery, then it's just gonna go. Yeah.
I also use another analogy, which kids and teenagers can relate to very well. You remember those old candy bar commercials when you like getting hangry, when you're not yourself and you turn into like a diva like Aretha Franklin or an obnoxious guy like Joe Pesci, right? When you're hangry is when you're overstimulated. And you're not really yourself. And so when an introvert is overstimulated, they get cranky, they get crabby, they get rude, they get obnoxious because they're overcooked.
Yeah.
So it really is healthy. And if they don't get that support, then what happens is an introvert tends to then blame themselves. What's wrong with me? Why can't I hack this? Like, it's only 2 hours. Or why am I so tired? This doesn't make sense. Nobody else is so tired. And they start to shame and blame themselves rather than understand how to work with their nature. And this is also kind of interesting because as psychologists, we love trying to figure out how to support people. But sometimes one of the great successes of our field is that we focus so much on nurture. We sometimes forget about nature. And it's about that wonderful interaction and so if you're an introvert and you have introverted parents and you know that the need for some quiet time or some reading time or some walking in nature time, or going to a cultural like a museum or something like that, you're fine. But what happens when you don't have an introvert parent, or you're in a classroom when the expectation is for you to participate and raise your hand and speak instead of be internally present?
Yeah.
Or you're expected to do a group project that most people hate anyway, but introverts especially hate, right? So there's different ways in which I think we can be more sensitive and to understand, are they an introvert? I was glad to see, I have a 4-year-old and he's watching Daniel Tiger. And there's a wonderful little episode in Daniel Tiger where the teacher basically supports each child at different points in the episode of when they need alone time.
Nice.
Say sometimes that's cool. And, I think sometimes we worry about, kids being social because that's important for their success or their growth. It's great, but solitude is good too. Solitude is different than loneliness, by the way.
Yeah.
This is the absence of connection and alienation. Solitude is connection more fully with oneself and the world through the inside.
I love that distinction.
Yeah.
And, it's like we want to be mindful, right? We want to teach meditation. Meditation is solitude, right? Meditative places. And our culture sometimes puts that as a supplement rather than as the foundation. And introverts, it's definitely the foundation.
I'm sitting here.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm thinking about yeah, my kiddos. And I'm always taking the information from these interviews and like making them very practical. Like, how can I take this into my own life?
You're modeling what we want our listeners to do, right?
Okay. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Make it practical. I'm a metaphor guy. So
So I'm thinking, my oldest son, Caleb, I talked about him. He's the one that had medical problem, has a lot of medical problems and is an amazing overcomer. But when he was younger, he had intractable degenerative epilepsy. And I was very protective of making sure he got downtime and quiet time, because more stimulation caused more seizures for him.
Yeah, makes sense. Very smart.
Yeah, greatly increased his seizure activity. So we pulled him out of school, anytime if there was a family reunion, a birthday party or whatever. I mean, I would very intentionally always have like some crayons, some paper, he had little handheld games that would just be soothing. And I would pull him aside. I would kind of be aware of the time, watch what was going on. And even if it seemed like he was having a good time, I'd say, hey, let's have a little quiet time in here, buddy. And I'd make sure that he got that time so his brain didn't explode with seizures, right?
Completely.
But I'm sitting here thinking, I have not made that same jump to my kids that are introverted. My daughter, Eliza, the one who brought the idea of creativity and that thing of we don't have to be good at it. She's an amazing artist. She's creative. She's always been crafty, creative art. She's, an incredibly gifted henna artist, has developed a great business. When she was younger, she would take that time doing her art. And she is more introverted. But when you have a big family, we got a big family, 9 kids.
Yeah, forget it.
There's no space for an introvert.
It's hard for an introvert in a big family. Yeah.
And I'm thinking of my 16-year-old, the one that I mentioned earlier, he does the D&D night, but he's very cerebral. He's quiet. He's very introverted. I have got to make a shift in my brain. I've got to realize that I need to honor that in him instead of saying, dude, come on, it's dinner time. Join the family.
Yeah.
That I need to go, your solitude is beautiful and that fuels who you are. I've been missing it and I need to make a change and I'm going to do it.
But you know what, Teri, I'm going to be your defense attorney for a moment. and just because you didn't know you hired me. And so the thing is, though, I think it's also hard to figure out the relative mix, right? So your situation is unique with having so many people in your household, right? That amps up the level of extroverted energy no matter what.
Right.
And so we just don't take that into account. We just assume our family is that this is just what families are. But now that you're saying, wait a minute, I'm looking at their actual temperament, who my individual children are, and I'm looking at the nurture, the environment, and how do I figure out what's the right combination? That's how we're creative in this stuff. And we don't usually become creative until we're kind of forced to look at this stuff. And I think this is a really good point for everybody, is that we're all going to have these seeming blind spots because we just know what we know until a new creative understanding comes along. And so here, like, it's a way of actually revisiting this thing of like, wait, this kid wants to do this a little bit and on their own. Maybe there's also a way of trying to offset some of the fact that the structure of your family is very extrovert centric because it has to be. Yeah. And that's nobody's fault. And that's not any moral judgment at all. It's not a bad thing. It's just what is.
Yeah.
Just as like an only child is going to have an easier time of having an introvert landscape and will need some more extrovert help because they didn't have to work with collaborating. So again, it's constantly looking at the nurture and the nature is, I think, how we become creative in this as parents, but also, and the other thing is really kind of like listening and trusting in what's the individual instinct. I love the other example that you said is when we have something that's easy to see, oh my gosh, he has this epilepsy, I need to protect this, how differently we view that, because we haven't thought of introversion as something of, wait, this is a neurological sort of thing, nothing bad, but just an important thing to know about. And I think it's pretty funny that as therapists don't take that into account either, right? You know, you go to the doctor, you should like know what your blood type is, but we don't talk about what's your best way of getting energy and losing it.
Right.
But we as parents can see that instantly. I know when my son is like, he's been boisterous at the playground for an hour and now he needs his introvert time watching Daniel Tiger by himself, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to point out that introversion can be stealthy, right? So especially with kids who, like me, who were comfortable on stage and still am, right? So like I speak all the time publicly. I'm a TEDx speaker, right? And that doesn't bother me at all. We tend to associate introversion with shyness, but it's not.
Right.
No, it's not.
And so parents might miss that.
Yeah, it's not shyness necessarily. It's not socially anxious, because you can have a socially anxious extrovert too, right? You can have someone who loves being with people, but they feel constantly obsessed about, are they going to be rejected? It's not, it's all about energy and how you get your energy. So that's totally right, Amy, that it's really important to make those distinctions. They're not loners necessarily, because you can have introverts talking to each other one-on-one and you'd think they're the most outgoing people in the world. They could talk for hours. In fact, when Freud and Jung met, Jung was a classic introvert. Freud was a classic extrovert. Apparently, they talked for like 13 hours in a row. They were just so excited. And I'm sure they both seemed like major extroverts at the time. So I think it's really important to notice that and that not kind of lose sight of what introversion really is. The other thing, Amy, that I want to point out that I think we don't think about as Americans is this ambivert term. We think in binaries a lot. It's is it, are you a Democrat, are you a Republican, are you this, are you that? And the gray sometimes we lose hold of. So the reason why sometimes people are confused, perhaps like for myself or maybe even you, Amy, or others out there in the audience, is because we do have an extroverted side that can be very gregarious and outgoing, but we also have a strong introverted side as well. Abraham Lincoln is a great example of this. Believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln could retreat and be very introspective, but he also would stay up late and tell gregarious stories with friends. And I think it's the reason why he was so interesting and successful as a leader, because introverts are very, like, they're tuned in and they can use that empathy to kind of really make connections. And I think Lincoln had that, but he also was a great orator because he had a lot of extrovert prowess as well. And the ambiverts, believe it or not, Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist at Wharton. And he did this interesting study where he said, who are the best salespeople? Extroverts, ambiverts, or introverts? Well, we all expect the extroverts to win, right? They seem to one always out there, ready to make the sale. Obviously, the introverts are probably not going to be the best salespeople, maybe, but it turns out the ambiverts were the best by far.
Yeah.
And the reason is because they're good synthesizers. They can figure out and tune into what a customer wants and needs and find a way to get out there, but not oversell. And so I want people to also remember that the ambiverts are the people that are also tricky to find. They're the stealth introverts, as you call them, Amy. Because people think, no, you're an extrovert. You're such a get along gal, such a get along guy. Yes, but remember, after I was a get along guy, I needed 2 hours of recharge time.
Right. Thus my mommy sabbatical perspective. I think I tend to think of myself as an extrovert, but yeah, I really am probably much more ambivert, like you said, because that mommy sabbatical time, that time to get away and just have quiet and be by myself is very important to me.
And that's why I call you the hard hybrids, by the way.
Yeah.
Because actually you need an equal level of fuel and charge to function optimally.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can be like, oh my God, I'm enjoying this. And you ever have an experience as an ambivert where you're like, oh my God, like I'm enjoying this conversation. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so fantastic. I'm getting so energized and I'm getting drained at the same time.
Yeah. Like later, a lot of times it's later because I'll be so energized from being with people. And then I'm with more people. And then I reach this point where I'm like, oh my gosh, too much noise. Nosedive,
right? And so that's where I think for ambiverts, it's a bit different. And so I think also parents can get confused if their child is an ambivert too, because they're like, wait a minute, I thought you were here, but now you're here. But no, it's again, finding that balance and regulation. Remember I said, we're basically just sophisticated emotion regulation machines.
It's a good term. I like that.
There we go.
So we've been talking for an hour.
Oh my goodness. This is the longest ever.
I know. So we need to wrap this up. But Michael, you have a book coming out. So you want to tell our listeners about that?
Yeah. So I have a book that's called Therapeutic Improvisation, How to Stop Winging It and Own It as a Therapist. It really, for me, is a love letter to the field of therapy and how it's interconnected with the arts, with music, with literature, with film. but also it's in Norton's interpersonal neurobiology series. So of course it's grounded in the neurobiology of how we're built. And I hope it helps, grad students, early career therapists, even therapists who've always thought of themselves as artists, kind of reclaim their voice. And I'm eventually hoping that it opens up a new way of thinking about mental health as living creatively.
Mm-hmm. And the field of life coaching is exploding. So life coaches would probably benefit from it as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the cool things is that I use a lot of case examples. So, precisely when Teri's like saying, practically, Mike, show me what this means. It's like, I really tried to make sure that it was very, very accessible and enjoyable. And as you can hear from talking to me, I like using a lot of metaphors because I think that helps us understand things better.
Yeah.
And a lot of pop culture references. I appreciate pop culture references in my books.
Yeah, movie references and stuff.
References,
I got a lot from that.
I got some Robin Williams in there. I got some, Jennifer Lawrence. We got everybody in there. Robert De Niro, you name it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. So to wrap up, what would you like to leave our listeners with?
Oh gosh. Well, I hope that we can revision how we think of mental health, but also how we think about how we can live creatively. And that we're actually built from the inside out to live creatively, whether we're artists or not. And that we can help kind of cultivate that creativity, not just for our children, but together with our children. And I think that to me is sort of the greatest gift. And I think that's where the magic happens.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right. So we are out of time and need to wrap up, but this has been a really fascinating and engaging conversation today. So we want to thank you, Dr. Michael Alcee, for sharing just all of this great insight. If you'd like more information about Michael's work, his website is michaelalcee, ALCEE.com. You can also find him on Facebook at Live Life Creatively 2. That's the number 2. But we'll put all of his links and social handles in our show notes. I'm also going to include links to all of the books that you mentioned, because I know that if people got intrigued by some of those authors that you quoted, we'll put all that in the show notes so that you guys can find that easily, as well as a link to your book, Therapeutic Improvisation, How to Stop Winging It and Own It as a Therapist. So thank you so much for listening today. If you liked our show, we would love it if you would leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. If you would rather watch us, we are on YouTube, and you can find us on every social media platform at the Brainy Moms. So look, until next time, we know that you're busy moms and we're busy moms. So we're out.
See ya.